Hello guys, and welcome back to the channel and for the 4th installment of my SkyBurger Devlog series. Now, this one is going to be a little bit of a different video. For those of you who have been following along with me on my journey, you'll know that for about a year, everything kind of went silent for me. I was still actively working on the game whenever I found the free time to do so, but I really fell behind on recording while I was also working on the game. It got to a point where I honestly didn't think I was going to make another devlog and would have to drop the series altogether due to the limited amount of time that I did have. Due to this, I stopped recording most of the time while I was working and just continued to work by myself, creating, testing, and learning on my own. Around January 2024, I started thinking about what I could do to start my devlog series back up. I had gotten pretty moderate reviews on the second devlog, so I knew the interest was there. As I had mentioned in the previous devlog, I had already begun working on the third devlog before everything at home began to demand more of my time. The problem was that the footage that I had captured didn't resemble the current state of the game at all. I kept thinking of how I would be able to close the massive gap in time and progress that I had made in the game without it being a huge leap. I decided that I would have to finish the third devlog as it was, and then release a video after showing the actual progress that I was able to make during the year. This is that video. So please join me as I show you the progress that I was able to make in the last year and hopefully give you a decent understanding of where the game currently is in development. So without any further hesitation, let's get right into it. So I think the first place to start off with would be the menu. Using Photoshop, I created an image that would be sort of a guide for how different sandwiches are made. This being a hamburger, a cheeseburger, and a double cheeseburger. Once I had this made, I headed over to Blender to create the board in the shape that the image would be sitting on. I brought the image into Blender and added a material slot for the image. I then UV unwrapped the cube so that the size of the image was proportionate with the face of the cube. I made the cube into a rectangular prism and exported the model over to the Unreal Engine. I added the texture to the model and made the texture have a bit of a glowing effect to help bring the order menu to life. I added the menu to the front and back side of the restaurant. This way the player could use it as a guide while creating the sandwiches and giving a bit of ambience to the front and back of the restaurant. After this, I began redesigning the orders widget. I began implementing the widget by adding variables that would set the text of the orders widget based on the type of sandwich that was being ordered by the customer. I needed to create a function that would represent the text for each table. Since there are 8 tables, I would need to create 8 different functions, each that would correspond to a specific table. Now that this was created, I needed to figure out a way to connect the widget, register, and player character together to share the information between each other. To do this, I created an event that would cast through the player character to the orders widget based on the table and the order number variable that the customer has. With the order widget functionality figured out, I decided that it was time to work on another essential mechanic in regards to the cooking aspect of the game: burning patties and having them catch on fire. I mean, what good is a cooking timer if there's no repercussions for exceeding its limit? I began by creating a smoke effect using the Niagara system. I already had a fire effect for the jetpack of the customers, so for testing purposes, I applied this effect to the burger patties themselves, and I really think that the result is pretty hilarious to see. I found some fire textures and UV maps and brought them into Unreal. I then created a material in Niagara system utilizing the fountain node and plugging in the fire textures that I had previously brought in. This worked well in creating a decent fire effect. Now that the fire was looking good, I just needed to implement this effect into the functionality of the burger patties blueprint. I decided that there should be something on the screen that indicates to the player that a fire was occurring even if the player wasn't looking directly at the grill. I created a fire image and applied it to a widget blueprint. I then decided that it would be nice to have a warning sign that could pop up in place of the cooking timer when the patty finally did catch on fire. I created another widget and added a warning image into the widget. I then added a widget component to the blueprint that I had created and applied the newly created widget into the component. Now that I had the warning widgets and the smoke and fire created, all that I had to do was figure out a way for these to communicate to each other and work together to produce the desired effect that I wanted. Inside of the burger patty blueprint, I created a custom event and named it very clearly, Fire Event. Genius, I know. I then added a spawn actor for the Fire Niagara particle system. I then created another custom event for the fire warning widget and added this trigger during the main fire event. After this, I added another actor spawner for the warning icon blueprint. I then added functionality for the warning widget to flip-flop between visible and hidden, and finally, after getting all of these new assets implemented, I finally got to the result that I was looking for. I created a fire extinguisher mesh and brought it into Unreal Engine. I made a blueprint that would utilize this mesh and added basic collision and physics to the mesh. After creating the blueprint, I moved back to the third-person character blueprint and began working on implementing the fire extinguisher mechanics. To begin this process, I implemented the naming functionality that occurred whenever the player reticle hovers over an interactable item. I utilized the functionality from the already existing event that I had already implemented within the player character blueprint. I added the naming interface that I had already created for all of the other items to the fire extinguisher blueprint and gave the fire extinguisher its name. After getting the naming mechanic working, I began making the item grabbable by the player. This was also easy to accomplish due to the mechanic already existing for the other interactable items. All I had to do was implement the grabbable interface that I had already created earlier and change the boolean variable to true. I did have to play with the physics for the blueprint a bit, as I didn't feel that the mesh was reacting the way that I wanted it to when the gravity was applied. I didn't really know what I was changing, but I did learn a lot about the physics engine just by playing with a few basic variables. After playing with these settings for a while, I managed to get the fire extinguisher to feel like it actually did have some sort of weight to it. Now that the interactable side of the blueprint was integrated, I needed to add an actual functionality of the fire extinguisher itself. I added a variable to third-person character blueprint that checks to see if the player character is holding the fire extinguisher. I then got a world location reference for the right hand of the player character and set the world location of the interacted item to the right hand. This would only trigger if the holding fire extinguisher variable was true. The mesh was reacting but not staying attached to the player character's right hand. To fix this, I added an overlap event for the right hand reference. I then added a check to see if the component has tags specific to the fire extinguisher mesh. If this was true, then the fire extinguisher would then attach itself to the right hand component reference. Once the fire extinguisher was finally attaching to the right hand component, I needed to rotate the mesh so that it would always be facing forwards when the player picked it up. Since the object was attaching to the right hand component, all I would have to do is rotate the right hand -90 degrees to ensure that the mesh would always be facing forwards. Now I had to implement the mechanic to have the player character release the fire extinguisher. I added the detach node and changed the boolean holding fire extinguisher to false when the player pressed the interact button while holding the fire extinguisher. Unfortunately, the first couple of tries of this did have some issues, but after playing around with the code for a while, I was able to get this functionality working properly. Now that the player could pick up and release the fire extinguisher, it was time to make the fire extinguisher actually put out fires. To add this functionality, I began by modifying the right mouse button event. I added a line trace after a branch that tested to see if the player was holding the fire extinguisher. I added a break hit node and tested the line trace, and after this, I added a box collision to the fire blueprint and added a tag to the box naming it fire. This is what the line trace coming from the fire extinguisher would hit, which we can use to trigger events within the player character blueprint. I added a check for the component tag utilizing this reference. I then moved the fire blueprint and added in the variable for the fire's health. I created a custom event that would be the trigger to decrease the health of the fire, and I set a cast to the fire blueprint that would be the trigger to the new custom event that I created within the fire blueprint. After getting this working, I added the functionality to decrease the fire life variable by adding a branch node that would test to see if the fire life variable is less than or equal to 0. If the variable is true, then a destroy node would essentially delete the fire and remove it. I then made the function loop if the right mouse button was pressed down, and this would allow the player to hold the mouse button down while using the fire extinguisher. With all of this added, I could finally test how all of these assets and mechanics were reacting with each other. Well guys, that's going to be it for this devlog. Thank you for checking out the channel and joining me in my journey on making this game. And if you would like to see more of these videos and support the channel and the game itself, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. This really helps a lot more than you think it does. Later.